the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Center's program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo del público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral. Que el cierre de brechas, que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
more than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to all member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, The Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures.
Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominica, Ecuador, El Salvador, the United States of America, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, Jamaica, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Suriname, Uruguay, and Venezuela. We have quorum, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, ASG. I will hand over to you and excuse myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Prince. Good morning, all. Good morning, distinguished permanent and alternate representatives, esteemed colleagues. Before beginning our activities today, allow me on behalf of the Permanent Council to convey our congratulations to the governments and peoples of St. Lucia, Guyana, and the Dominican Republic for the celebration of their national days on February 22nd, 23rd, and 27th, respectively. I also take this opportunity to recognize all the women of our hemisphere, and particularly the distinguished permanent and alternate representatives, as well as officials of the General Secretariat, on the occasion of the commemoration of the Day of Women of the Americas, observed on February 18th. We salute you for all your contributions. I am pleased to declare open this regular meeting of the Permanent Council, convened to consider the items contained in the order of business document CP/OD 2366/22, which I hereby submit for the consideration of this council. There being no observations or concerns, we will proceed to adopt it without amendment. Esteemed colleagues, our next item is the presentation of the report of the interdisciplinary group of independent experts in accordance with the request made by the permanent mission of the plurinational state of Bolivia in note CP/INF 9278/22. The presentation will be given by the following four experts. First, Ms. Patricia Tapata is Professor of the Master's Program in International Human Rights Law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Buenos Aires and member of the Advisory Board of Archives, a project of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the Swiss Federal Archives, and the Swiss Peace. From 2017 to 2021, she was the director of the International Center for the Advancement of Human Rights, and between 2013 and 2016, she served as director of civil society relations in her country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Up until July 2012, she was the director of Memoria Abierta, an organization which she created in 2000 and led during its early years. Between 1996 and 1999, she served on the Board of Trustees of the Institute of Democracy in South Africa. For 3 years, she coordinated the Regional Leadership and Social Responsibility Program conducted by the Kellogg Foundation in 7 Latin American countries. She led the Justice in Argentina program and the Political Representation Program of the Poder Ciudadano Foundation from 1993 to 1997. She was also the director of the Truth Commission for El Salvador for the period UN 1992 to 1993, and coordinator of the Human Rights Department of the National Conference of Bishops of Peru from 1977 through 1987. She's the author of numerous articles and has contributed to books on human rights, democratic transitions, memory and democracy, and other related topics. She holds a degree in social work from the National University of Cordoba and completed her postgraduate studies in social sciences at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Buenos Aires. By contrast, Mr. Marlon Wishart has been a Brazilian federal prosecutor since 1995. From 2016 to 2020, he served as a deputy in the Office of the Federal Attorney for Citizens' Rights. He's a specialist in transitional justice, human rights, and business, public security, and the prevention of mass atrocities. He was the driving force behind the prosecution service's efforts to search for and identify the remains of victims of forced disappearance. He also served on the federal government's Reparations Commission. For 4 years, Mr. Wishart holds a master's degree in state law and was a research fellow of the Hauser Global Fellows Program at New York University School of Law. He has written more than 40 publications on human rights and transitional justice. The next person is Ms. Magdalena Correa. She's a constitutional lawyer, doctor in law, professor of constitutional law and economics and social rights, and a senior researcher of the Higher Studies Committee for the Institutional Strengthening of the Colombian Army. She has been assistant judge at the Constitutional Court of Colombia, director of the Department of Constitutional Law at the Externado University of Colombia, consultant to the Andean Commission of Jurists, member of the independent panel convened by Due Process of Law Foundation, the Washington Office on Latin American, and the Center for Justice and International Law. To evaluate the judges of the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court of El Salvador and the advisor to public and private projects in favor of social and economic inclusion in Bogota Aqua Foundation. The last of the four are Mr. Julian Berger, is a visiting professor at the Human Rights Center of the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. He has also taught human rights courses at institutions such as the University of London School of Advanced Study and Alcalá de Henares University of Madrid. For more than 20 years, he headed the program on indigenous peoples and minorities at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, where he was responsible for the negotiations toward the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and helped establish the main guaranteed mechanism related to indigenous peoples. He has written extensively on human rights and indigenous peoples. Before proceeding, I respectfully reminded the distinguished experts that each presentation should last no longer than 7 minutes. Having said that, and in accordance with the order of business, I now give the floor first to Ms. Patricia Tapata. Ms. Tapata, you have the floor, madam.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to interrupt you. The ambassador of Bolivia is requesting the floor.
Thank you very much. Ambassador for Bolivia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, now that you've given the credentials of all the speakers of this session, I would like to thank you for convening this meeting and for all the cooperation with the Permanent Council, and also at the same time thank the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, particularly the members of the Independent Experts Group members, who today will speak about the findings of human rights and what happened between the 1st of September and onwards in Bolivia. Mr. Chairman, the raison d'etre of our organization, we understand human beings and people who live in the Americas. We have to identify and say more rights for more people. We would like to pay tribute to those people who uphold rights in my country. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to speak to Mario Sabat in the Department of Santa Cruz, Mr. Guzman, Mr. Umani, who passed in Cochabamba, Percy Conde, Mr. Condori, Jose Alcon, Martin Felix, and Sebastian Moro, who passed in the Department of La Paz, Talina, and others, Cisaya, passed at the hands of the police and the armed forces, Mr. Merida, Macías Rojas, Jorge, Mr. Carballo, Juan López, Ujastance, Marcos Vargas, González, and Roberto Cejas, dead in a massacre that took place in Cochabamba the 15th of November. Sotena, Juan Jorge, Juan Tenorio, Antonio Crispe, Vázquez, Omani, Omanaco, Costo, Seper, Inace, Fernandez, dead in a massacre on the 19th of November 2019. Mr. Chairman, having read those names and thinking about each and every one of them, they were a mother, a father, a child, a son. They did not go back home. All of the injured people, even today, there are many other cases that have been affected with grave pain and couldn't go back to be with their families. We hope to build a better society and humbly will work to build my country and look at the institutionality and democracy based on the pain that we've seen in the last 40 years. We're doing our level best in the hands of President Kachitora. We will work so that this doesn't repeat again, ever, in Latin America or in the world, as we uphold human rights. Given the gravity of these facts, these are historical, and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights under Paulo Brown, between the 22nd and 26th of November, looked at putting together an interdisciplinary group, the third in the history of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. This was done to suss out the facts and to reestablish the constitutional order in Bolivia in 2020. The group worked for more than 2 months in a very precise, laser-focused way. And this is precisely the report that you will hear today from the very voice of the experts. The final report of several hundred pages is one of the most legally grounded documents that we have that speaks to justice in Bolivia, and also it's a fundamental contribution upholding institutionality, democracy, and the rule of law in all member countries of the OAS. Having offered this brief introduction, Mr. Chairman, we would like to deeply thank the former chair of the Human Rights Commission, Mr. Nogueira, and President Pascual of the ICHR, Commissioner for Bolivia, Mr. Hernandez, and all of those other members of the ICHR, Mr. Lenore on the executive board, and thank them for all of the tireless work in the Bolivian case. Thanks to each and every one of the experts who have looked at this cause, Mr. Chairman, and who will now give very important, historically important reports concerning our country. Thank you very much.
Welcome, sir. Thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. I see that we have next on the list a request for the floor from Marlon Wishart. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Secretary, permanent representatives of countries. We're here to present to you the results of the work in the plurinational state of Bolivia concerning human rights, when it signed an agreement with the interdisciplinary group, the independent group, to look at Bolivia and to investigate the grave accounts, the violations of human rights that took place between September and December 2019. The interdisciplinary groups and the members of the interdisciplinary group represent a mechanism to investigate grave facts soon after they have taken place. They are made up of people from various countries and have the knowledge and the experience and the skills to investigate these complex facts, and they take on the responsibility to be independent, which will influence those who also work on investigating states and cooperate in setting up frameworks and looking at reparation for victims, as well as make recommendations. This group is autonomous and independent when looking at elections and so on. So I'm talking also about the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. They're made up of many different people from different nationalities, but in no case do they represent the countries that they come from. Since disappearances, the group was set up and looked at the 43 disappeared in Mexico. Jurists and others were part of that. Secondly, in Nicaragua, they investigated the violence that took place in that country in 2018. And for Bolivia, only after the facts took place, violations of human rights, that is, and what took place during the electoral process in 2019, was there a visit by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights to that country. The experts that participated, Juan Mendez, couldn't be with us because he had other commitments at the United Nations. Mr. Baser, Magdalena Correa, and myself, we are here. The agreement entrusted the group to look at what happened during the elections and the arbitrary detentions, the irregular activities that took place, denying people their freedom, and the police actions and the forced detentions and the torture, confiscation of property, threats within the framework of the protest and the mobilization that took place. And I would like to underscore that according to the agreement in December 2019, it was actually November 2020 once the government of Luis Arce was set up that talks took place looking at the health issues we would like to underscore here and now the willingness and the efforts made by everyone to honor the commitment of the plurinational state of Bolivia that it took on a year before, and the support of the mission through the responses to all of the information that we garnered, as well as the access we had to players in the state whilst respecting the autonomy thereof. 5 Latin American professionals stayed in Bolivia for 8 months, and we traveled around to Cochabamba, Bolivia Alta, to Chalapati, Santa Cruz, in addition to many other places, to hear from the victims and the families of those who had died, and to get together with civil society and other non-governmental organizations, the former members of the armed forces, and politicians, in addition to other people. Our investigation was within the strict framework of international law and human rights, and it included individual interviews of victims, civil servants, and members of civil society organizations and members of the armed forces, as well as police forces. We did our report, which was specialized with an analysis based on forensic information, and we examined archives and thousands of different bits of experiences that were given to us by different ministries, the Ministry of Public Police. We used the archives, which were in the public domain, to identify the incidents of people who were implied and to corroborate and contextualize the information that we had received from the different interviews. We did more than 400 interviews, and there were many people from different institutions who shared with us their own stories and their own documents to make the investigation possible. We would like to thank all of them for their cooperation and for their trust. This was organized in 8 sections, and there's a description of the backdrop or the context of the crisis when we investigated the facts. We analyzed not only the grave activities that took place with most of these victims. Normally, this has a great impact, but we also tried to include all the facts that involve violence and the breach of human rights within the framework of the political crisis at that time. And then there is a section that speaks to the rights that are breached, and there are plans to investigate the other crimes identified that should be carried out as soon as possible so as to overcome this perception of impunity. We also broached the structural situation, and we found determining facts to make it possible to protect human rights and to return to democratic stability, because this is the bedrock which will overturn violence. And then we had some of the main points for reparations of victims in keeping with the rights according to them and in keeping with international human rights law. We looked at the problems in the electoral process, and whether it was fraud or a coup d'etat, nor did we look at the reports at the end of our mandate. We preferred the participation of other sectors when it came to weapons that have been used in the conflict. And we considered that the 3 issues were not part of the mandate we had received. The report ends with a host of different conclusions and recommendations that I've referred to. Nonetheless, I'm going to refer to a specific chapter, the chapter that speaks to the context that goes into the granular details and the development of the crisis that ended up in the conflict where 37 people lost their lives, recently, as named by the ambassador, and hundreds of people that were also involved. The report began in 2005 and went up to 2019, going over the various decisions and the various events linked to the political institutionality, the branches in Bolivia that were involved, to look at the behavior of the different actors, public servants, political party leaders, social group leaders, and members of the police forces and the armed forces, in addition to many others, laying the ground to see how the mechanism of democracy worked without overlooking everything that had been affected. The grave facts did not happen overnight. They were preceded by a wave of violence by those who dealt with political leaders. And rapidly, things broke down into violence. And there were many who expressed ideological affiliation with the various branches. These practices should be analyzed and hopefully will not lead to any repetition of the facts that we've analyzed. Now, I should like to give the floor to my colleague. Mr. Weikart. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Permanent Council, I would like to offer this presentation after the esteemed presentation given by Patricia Tapata. My intervention will be on the main conclusions and findings of our mandate. The GIEI has concluded that serious human rights violations were committed in Bolivia during the last quarter of 2019. In the context of a political conflict surrounded by violence, at least 37 people lost their lives in various parts of the country, and hundreds of people received serious injuries, both physical and psychological. There were summary executions by the police and the armed forces, and homicides committed by private individuals, facilitated or tolerated by state agents. The GIEI verified the occurrence of 2 massacres and military actions. The recurrent use of torture and other attacks on the personal integrity of persons under the state control was also confirmed. The police and the armed forces, in separate actions or in joint operations, frequently used force excessively and disproportionately. They also failed to prevent acts of violence practiced by groups of civilians, both related and opposed to the ruling party, which attacked citizens considered political opponents, human rights defenders, journalists, as well as officials and political agents. People were detained by groups of civilians and even subjected to torture and kidnapping with the complicity or acquiescence of state agents. Others were attacked with firearms in an ambush prepared by with the participation of officials and political leaders. Health services and ambulances were left unprotected and also suffered acts of violence. The GIEI considers it in accordance with the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that these acts are also violations of human rights under the responsibility of the state. The press is an actor that also deserves to be enhanced. It was intensely harassed and several journalists were injured. The security forces once again failed to protect these professionals. Likewise, the state itself pursued some of these activities. The explosion of violence in Bolivia was not unexpected. It was preceded by antagonistic speeches by recognized leaders and by political decisions that strained the rules of the way democracy works and the rule of law. The GIEA, to contextualize the crisis, has reviewed a sequence of acts and pronouncements by the governments, the opposition and political leaders since 2013, which revealed a growing process of deterioration of democratic coexistence. Leaders on both sides of the political spectrum not only stopped strengthening dialogue through democratic arenas, but also encouraged individuals to defend their political interests arbitrarily, illegally, or violently. The GIEI has also identified that the explosion of violence was the result of historical factors, especially racial discrimination against indigenous peoples and the non-acceptance by some social segments of the accession they have had in recent years in terms of political participation. Indigenous women, in particular, were the target of racist demonstrations. On the other hand, leaders appealed to ethnic identity as a criterion to indicate whether or not to belong to Bolivian society. Thus, political adherences or political affiliations were dangerously racialized and used as a factor to deepen social and political polarization. Gender discrimination and sexual violence are other elements that should be highlighted. Women are historically more affected in times of conflict, and during the 2019 crisis, it was no different. The GIEI reported several cases of violations of women's personal integrity and sexual abuse. The judiciary was unable to prevent illegal and arbitrary detentions or to investigate and punish those responsible for human rights violations. On the contrary, the judiciary and the public prosecutor's office were actors in investigations without due diligence and criminal prosecutions without due process. These institutions also allowed the use of justice for political persecution. It's true that the use of criminal proceedings for political persecution is not presented as an issue limited to the crisis of 2019, but as a distortion that permanently affects the justice system, especially with the use of the face of terrorism and sedition, which are defined in Bolivia as disagreement with the parameters of international law. The use of pre-trial detention is a factor that's serious and of constant concern, repeatedly adopted illegally and arbitrarily in scenarios of obvious incompatibility or out of lockstep with the right to due process. Judges do not adequately exercise control over criminal charges and the presence of strict requirements for pre-trial detention. This is a rule when it should be exceptional. The transformation carried out in Bolivia in search of a more diverse and inclusive society were not accompanied by any reform of the administration of justice and the security forces. These two institutions, directly connected to the observance of human rights and the way democracy works, lagged behind in the process of change. Bolivian society is eager for justice, either in its dimension of accountability and punishment of those responsible for acts of violation of human rights, or as a perspective of integral reparation to the victims. However, that same society fears that justice is selective and a political instrument. Impunity not only denies and opposes these legitimate desires for truth and justice of those who are violated in their dignity, as it promotes as well the repetition of the crimes and affects the legitimacy of the rule of law. For this reason, it is essential that progress be made in the investigations and judicial processes of all the facts documented in the report. However, these processes must be conducted with strict observance of due diligence and due process of law, principles that the Bolivian state has profound difficulty in guaranteeing, as observed by the GIEI. The failure to carry out justice is undoubtedly the result of deficits in the independence and the autonomy of the public prosecutor's office and the judiciary, which are structurally violated by their low budgets, the provisional nature of the vast majority of judges and prosecutors, and the undue interference by the government and political interests in matters of justice. A firm political will from the highest level, explicit and shared between the authorities of the plurinational state and other political and social actors, is necessary to guarantee the independence of these institutions. One of the characteristics of Bolivian society is its dynamism, which is expressed in assemblies, town halls, and constant mobilizations in the streets. It is necessary that the energy and industriousness of these movements be expressed in a field of democratic dialogue, working for the coexistence between different people who decide to relate in an intercultural democracy is essential to avoid violent confrontation. In summary, the GIEI has confirmed that the rights to life, personal integrity, liberty, and personal security, honor, dignity, and private life, judicial guarantees, and due process, freedom of expression, association and assembly, non-discrimination, health, property, work, and information were violated. It is possible and necessary to promote justice and reparation for all victims, to all without criteria of political, social, or geographic discrimination. It is also essential to move forward with reforms in the public and private spheres to prevent repetition. For these purposes, and within the framework of its mandate, the group of independent experts has made several recommendations on which Dr. Magdalena Correa will speak shortly.
We're running into a little difficulty. I asked at the outset that we try to keep the submissions down to 7 minutes. We have 4 presenters, and I noticed that at the outset we had a combination of presenters, one which has not been registered with us for presenting. I would like to urge again that we stick very closely to the time schedule that has been allowed. We have a very long schedule today. And so next I would like to hear from Ms. Tapata. You have the floor.
Good morning. I'm Magdalena Correa, one of the experts, and I will be presenting the recommendations that are contained in the report. I thank you for this honor, and I'm so very happy to have this opportunity together with my colleagues to present to the Permanent Council these results of our report. I'd like to now present our recommendations. In line with what my colleagues presented, in our report, we have 60 recommendations. Chapter 6 and 7 about the judgments and trials with regard to what happened, and also with regard to reparations for victims. This is together with 36 final recommendations, which also include measures that need to be adopted. With regard to the report's recommendations, well, first, there are recommendations about the investigations, about the events. Some are general, others are specific, and in general, we want to have justice. We need to have effective, thorough, and diligent investigations with respect for the rights of victims and those who are accused, and also punishment of those responsible. And this has to do with those who committed the crimes. We need to go forward with investigations with regard to violence, and regard to what my colleague said, in addition to these investigation of the events with regard to sexual violence, or for gender violence, we need to make sure that these happens, and this needs to be with respect to the human rights of victims. Of course, we have reparation measures as such, as well as in assurances for non-repetition, as well as other structural measures. First of all, recommendations which are aimed at strengthening institutions. First of all, with regard to the system of justice, which is in line with what was presented by the UN rapporteurship as far as judicial independence is concerned. We need to make sure that the reform goes forward with regard to the justice system to ensure judicial independence, especially with regard to interventions from the executive branch, measures to ensure stability at the courts, so that people and judges know that they can be assured of their positions, where there are fair competitions for judgeships. Also, there need to be resources so that justice can be meted out. Other recommendations that are very important and in line with what my colleagues said, there need to be reforms of the police so that there can be more transparency, respect for human rights, and to also ensure everyone's rights that are involved. We need to strengthen independence and institutionality of electoral justice. Furthermore, there are other recommendations to ensure human rights and civil rights. For example, due diligence, and also recommendations as far as criminal justice is concerned, and to fight violations of human rights. Also to avoid pretrial detention, and also avoid using crimes that are defined as crimes of terrorism when these are not appropriate. Also, the crime of torture needs to be defined better. This is particularly important because of the right to protest. We need to also have supervision of police forces when there are protests, and to have better protection for freedom of expression, freedom of information, freedom of press. Furthermore, there are recommendations which are aimed at improving society and its institutions when there are conflicts, to have concrete measures to eradicate discrimination and racism, both at a political level but also at a societal level. We need to also highlight the importance and the beauty of having a multiracial and diverse society, because conflict can lead to violence and violations of human rights, and also to facilitate mediation over disagreements that exist. We also wanted to highlight the recommendations that promote the work and results and that can be effective. We need to have follow-up mechanisms. One of them, it would be an external mechanism that already exists. That is the collaborative follow-up mechanism that the IACHR uses, and the complementary measures that can exist at a national level. These need to be solid and robust, and all agencies involved need to be part of this. And we need to also have participation of citizens so that they can also ensure that the state adopts measures that will bring about justice and reparation for victims, and so that society can again believe in the legitimacy of this state, which guarantees democracy, human rights, values that Bolivian society supports. Thank you.
Next, we would have Mr. Berger. You have the floor, sir.
Gracias. Y voy a tratar de guardar unas.
Thank you. I will try to only speak for 5 minutes. I'm aware of the time, Chair. I'm sure I'm going to repeat some of what my colleagues have said. Can you hear me? Wonderful. The group of experts wanted to offer a report that was future-looking, and so it identified some aspects, but mostly two that we found are necessary in the long term. One has to do with the justice system and its reform, and all of my colleagues have referred to this, so that it can be independent from politics and it can be just and impartial. Secondly, actions to ensure reconciliation of social, political, economic, and race divisions, which have existed for a long time and still exist. So the group made proposals to strengthen communication channels between different groups that do not agree, and possibly a national conference on racism and discrimination. It is important to underscore, as my colleagues did, what the report does not state. The report does not say that there was electoral fraud, nor that there was a coup d'etat. These are opinions that the group has not considered to be under its mandate. And it does not state that the interim government committed genocide. The group did not find any reasons to conclude that, but the report does ensure that, or does state that the violence in Sencata should be considered massacres, given the large number of people who peacefully protested and were murdered by the police and law enforcement. And we have recommended that there be a thorough investigation and that those responsible be prosecuted. The report, and I want to underscore this, identifies many acts of violence and violations of human rights during this period. These were perpetrated by all kinds of political actors. An important point in the report is that despite the horrible violations of human rights which occurred during this period by the provisional government, the acts of violence were perpetrated by groups throughout the entire political spectrum. That was a conclusion based on official records, visual material, interviews with victims and witnesses, as well as other sources. In that regard, the report calls upon the justice system to act justly, impartially, and diligently with regard to all acts of violence, including those that have to do with reparations. On behalf of my colleagues, I would like to pose a question to the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia. Where do you, or how do you think these recommendations can be applied? We were moved by the support of the president and the ministers when we presented the report in August of last year. The matters contained in the report were recognized by the government, and the government committed to apply the recommendations of the expert group. The group recognizes the challenges that the government is facing to recover from the economic, social crisis that came about because of COVID. But fortunately, we think that is subsiding, but just like other groups of experts created through international and regional cooperation, the members of the group hope that their recommendations can be instituted practically and pragmatically thanks to efforts of the government to address what the government recognizes as structural problems, and that this becomes action. This is very important with regard to reparations of victims especially, and also investigation and prosecution of those responsible for acts of violence identified in the report. It is said that late or delayed justice is no justice. Finally, the group of experts affirms its support for the steps undertaken by the government of Bolivia in cooperation with the Inter-American Commission with respect to a follow-up mechanism for this report. Once this mechanism is established, we hope it will support the government appropriately and practically, and will be a complement to the measures that are being taken domestically to implement these recommendations. The group believes that the creation of an internal mechanism with the participation of victims and civil society to be extremely important to be able to move forward with justice and transparency. The members of the group express their thanks to the government for its support during our investigations on site. The members of the group are available to support any measures that the government undertakes later or that the Commission undertakes later. Thank you very much.
Berger, I appreciate that a great deal. Now, we do have, we'd like to hear from the delegates, but given that we have a very hard deadline to meet on at 11 o'clock, I'd like to just receive those two who are in the group now who have requested to speak, and I'd like to afford them 5 minutes each. I'd appreciate that. Ambassador Charles, you have the floor, sir. Well, we're not hearing from... Sorry?
I think he has technical problems.
Then perhaps we can go to the next one, then. That would be Saron Sanders, Antigua and Barbuda. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this item is far too important a matter for delegations not to be able to speak out on it. I'd just like to say that the delegation of Antigua and Barbuda is grateful to this interdisciplinary group of independent experts for Bolivia that has presented its report to this Permanent Council today concerning the violence and human rights violations that occurred in Bolivia from September 1st to December 31st, 2019. My delegation also expresses its appreciation to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for the support it gave to the independent group of experts in the conduct of its work. Frankly, Mr. Chairman, my delegation is appalled at the violence and human rights violations that occurred in Bolivia. We are especially alarmed at the role of the armed forces in the political process in Bolivia, which led to the resignation of former President Evo Morales. The questionable role of the armed forces is described in the report by eyewitness testimony and other incriminating evidence that should trouble every member of this organization. My delegation was impressed by the methodology adopted by the independent group of experts in the conduct of their inquiry. We particularly congratulate them for taking testimonies of victims, family members, and witnesses on a voluntary and confidential basis, and for creating an atmosphere of trust and comfort for the people who gave that testimony. Mr. Chairman, throughout the period that the independent group examined, it is now clear that many violations of human rights were occurring in Bolivia right under the noses of the members of this permanent council, and we failed to respond. These violations were especially directed at indigenous people and at members of the media. The list of incidents provided by the group is troubling. According to their report, at least 37 people lost their lives in different parts of the country, and hundreds of people received serious physical and psychological injuries. Alarmingly, as the report states, and the experts have just testified themselves, these events involve state responsibility for acts of their state agents and individuals. The report clearly states that police and the armed forces, operating both separately and jointly, used excessive and disproportionate force and did not adequately prevent acts of violence, leaving innocent citizens unprotected. Ethnic identity was used as a criterion for whether or not someone belonged to a Bolivian society. Racist violence was perpetrated against indigenous peoples, including women, who were particular targets at that time. Mr. Chairman, the independent group rightly observes that the right to life and a life with dignity belongs equally to all inhabitants of Bolivia. The report makes several recommendations whose implementation my delegation urges. Among them is the creation of an independent mechanism within the state structure to monitor the use of force and the actions of security forces during demonstrations and social protests. The group also recommends that the state takes into consideration the analysis of damages to victims and adopt measures for making reparations to them. It is only right, Mr. Chairman, that this should be done. From all accounts, these people suffered because of their ethnicity or their political views. Mr. Chairman, the report recommends that the state and the IACHR jointly and collaboratively design and implement a special follow-up mechanism within the framework of the Inter-American Human Rights System. It suggests that this mechanism must identify the measures implemented by the state and other recipients, the challenges that they may face with that implementation, and the results obtained must guarantee the rights of victims and their relatives to truth, justice, and importantly, to reparation. My delegation strongly supports the plea of Mr. Justin Berger just made here in this Permanent Council for the implementation of the report's recommendations. And we urge this Permanent Council and the IACHR to give every assistance to the authorities in Bolivia to ensure that the machinery is established to ensure that there is never any repetition of human rights violations and violence that took place, especially directed at ethnic groups. Mr. Chairman, we of this Permanent Council also need to improve our own system of vigilance so that we do not inadvertently and unwittingly allow tyrannical governments to violate human rights while they sit amongst us. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Saran. Next, we have the Ambassador for Canada. You have the floor, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I also want to thank the members of the group for their report.
Oh, okay, sorry.
You have a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Bolivia, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I am sorry to interrupt with respect to this point of order. With due respect, I believe that we need to make sure that we commemorate and celebrate the designation of the OAS historic buildings as National Historic Landmarks. And I understand that is important. But I know that this is also an important point because this has to do with human rights. So I think that we should not limit people's remarks. I don't think should run and do this commemoration so quickly. I know that's an important point, but you know, people have died in the events that occurred, and I don't think that delegations' comments should be limited. I don't think that's justified. Thank you.
Very much for sharing that point of view. Next, we have the alternate for the U.S. You have the floor, sir. Mr. Lester.
Sorry, Chairman. I think Canada was interrupted, sir. Sorry to interrupt you.
Canada, you have the floor now, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'aurais quelques...
Thank you very much. I just have a few points to make. I agree that we need to hear from the members on this very important matter. But I will be very brief. As I have said before, Canada understands the importance of the IACHR to protect and promote human rights. We appreciate the report of the group of experts. They have made important recommendations to support the search for truth and justice with respect to the political crisis that occurred in 2019 in Bolivia. In order to promote these recommendations and reduce polarization, we need to make sure that the recommendations of the group of experts are followed, and we should not, and no one should use this group's recommendations selectively for political reasons. I want to underscore that the dependence of justice and impartial procedures for all are important in order to have full democracy. Thank you.
Very much, Ambassador. Next, we have the alternate for the USA. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Chair, and also to the permanent mission of Bolivia for raising this important agenda item today. I'll be brief as well. The United States appreciates the important work of the IACHR and the members of the GIEI on this report, which we believe aims to provide a balanced account of the events that unfolded in Bolivia from September to December 2019. First and foremost, we express our solidarity with the victims of these tragedies. Second, the findings of the GIEI report can serve to encourage positive reforms in Bolivia. We note, however, that any legal proceedings stemming from the recommendations put forth in this report should be conducted consistent with fair trial guarantees. The human rights of all parties should be respected to show the world credible and transparent justice has been served. The United States urges the Bolivian government to implement impartial, credible judicial processes that provide equal treatment to its political allies and opponents. We thank the government of Bolivia for its willingness to consider the recommendations of the GIEI report. Finally, as OAS member states, we must all work together to ensure democracy and human rights are respected in the Americas. Thank you, Chair.
You're most welcome, sir. Next, we have the Ambassador for Trinidad and Tobago. You have the floor, sir.
Good morning, Chair, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, Excellencies, permanent representatives and alternate representatives, and a special good morning to our distinguished panel of presenters, members of the GIEI in Espanol. Chair, in the interest of time, I will not rehearse and read all of the comments that were included in our statement. I wish to, however, signal Trinidad and Tobago's deep appreciation for the work undertaken by the interdisciplinary group of independent experts on this matter. Chair, distinguished colleagues, we will all recall Resolution CP-Res 1142, which this Permanent Council adopted in December of 2019, and which in fact call for this work undertaken by the GIEI to be undertaken. The delegation of Trinidad and Tobago considers the work undertaken here, the findings made in the process and the recommendations to be very useful, not only for the case of Bolivia, but as a good example of the process to be followed should there be, hopefully not, but should there be a similar occurrence. This delegation must also identify with the remarks made certainly by all delegations that have taken the floor, particularly by the delegation of Antigua and Barbuda, highlighting several of the key concerns raised in the findings. And we again wish to reiterate that our resolution 1142, in fact, immediately, even as these occurrences were being perpetrated, we responded and called for the work undertaken here. Trinidad and Tobago is grateful and again expresses appreciation to the delegation of Bolivia for requesting the inclusion of this item on our agenda, and to you, Chair, for allowing it. A very important item. We are grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Argentina. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We'd like to thank you for the report and for covering so many different aspects. We consider that when dealing with these kinds of issues, we must bear in mind the victims. They're human beings. These kinds of violations of human rights, the political concerns, and other aspects cannot overshadow the fact that people suffer. The importance of these reports when they take place on site is a double win. First, we see that the Inter-American System of Human Rights accepts bodies, institutions, groups from the Inter-American System, and they are on point. The reports have been crafted, and many different organizations have heard the testimonies of members from civil society. And we all know that there is specific funding behind some of the representatives that call themselves civil society, but they have ideological political tacks or leanings. We have to underscore here the interest in this concept. And when we have these kinds of reports on things that happen, we have to also look at these other interests that are manipulated. We have to look at the part of the report not covered coup d'etats, for example, and we have to look at the shame of those that participated in governments which at that point were present. Ministers, even representatives, former representatives, in situations where things were exacerbated with the use of arms, as well as the other points that were described in these reports. Now, why am I bringing this in? Because democracies are a way of underscoring these kinds of facts and bringing to justice these kinds of violations. We are in an organization that has a very deep-seated responsibility that has created the conditions, social and political ways and means for these kinds of coups d'etats. And this is not a singular case, a closed case. We have to go back and recoup the legitimacy of this organization. This is an historical responsibility of this organization when it takes on certain positions and looks at electoral processes and these kinds of coups d'etats. There are people who perfectly well understand this. And let me conclude by saying, as I said at the beginning, that the truth, human rights, when they speak to one place and to no other, they no longer belong to the category of shared principles. When they work with other ways and means, human rights have to be the same everywhere, not in some places and then denied in others. Thank you very much.
Welcome, sir. Next, we have the Ambassador from Mexico. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In all due respect, I should like to mention that I don't think it's correct to have requested that we've been asked for a minimum amount of time or not participate in such a crucial issue in this organization. Human life, massacres in one of the member states. If that's not a priority of the organization, then I don't understand at all what the priorities are. Why are we so concerned in participating in condemning these massacres and other kinds of arbitrary activities? Now the regional groups are represented, and it's really very sad, but it represents, or we have to look at the priorities of this organization and the political maneuverings of these priorities. My delegation would like to express appreciation for this member being included on the agenda today by Bolivia, and we truly appreciate the very important presentations of the men and women presenters and their sterling work. Mexico recognizes the work done by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the conclusions of which were part of the visit to that country between the 22nd of September onwards in 2019, speak to Bolivians and speak to the interdisciplinary group of experts for Bolivia and their work as an impartial autonomous group to carry forth with the investigations on the facts that took place and that pointed to abuses of human rights between September and December of 2019. We understand the gravity of the facts and the importance of these things. Mexico financially supported this work as a demonstration of the acknowledgement of this organization and the work. Given the findings in the report of everything that took place in Bolivia between September and December 2019, we recognize that this is a dark chapter in the history of this country and our hemisphere, and it requires action. This speaks to the democracy and the work of the electoral mission in Bolivia. When we looked at the political ways and means which gave rise to the coup d'etat in Bolivia, it is necessary to go back and refresh our memory and have justice for everything that has happened in this country and guarantee that this never happens again anywhere else in the hemisphere. The issue is open-ended until we can clarify the role of the OAS in unacceptable activities for our countries, and which is a grave precedent when we see political things that can be used in any of our countries and which is coming out of the OAS, and this is doubly grave, and it's an attempt, I should say, an affront against the principles of the organization. So it's very important for the Secretary to think about the role before, during, and after the events that took place in Bolivia in 2019, and fortunately found its way to democracy thanks to the efforts of Bolivian men and women, and did not succumb to the imposition of anything else. Mexico feels that, given the evidence that the Secretary General of the OAS intervened in the Bolivian process so as to make a change of the government, and there was the narrative of fraud, which gave rise to a breach of the constitutional order, and this deepened extreme violence and the abuse of human rights and led to massacres, tortures, persecutions, summary executions, dramatic expressions of abuse, in addition to the harassment that even went as far as the Mexican embassy in Bolivia. This kind of situation and behavior is an affront to international law, and it should never again be repeated in our hemisphere. We have to condemn this. Member states should never allow ourselves to violate the principles, the purposes, and the values in our founding charter. This is the bedrock of our organization and cannot accept any affront against democracy and the solidarity of all states. Nowhere in the Inter-American Democratic Charter does it stipulate that the OAS or the Secretary General have the power to carry out electoral processes. The observation missions, the EOMs, are the tool to strengthen the national skills and wherewithal and not to lay waste their institutions. Nonetheless, when looking at this behavior, we have to point to objectivity. We decidedly say that the electoral missions should be used and have been used for coup d'etats. We see the painful path Bolivia has had and look at the sovereign nature of its government to decide and deal with the recommendations of the GIEI for the plurinational state of Bolivia. This will help to go back and refresh the memory and read out justice for human beings. Mexico will continue to work within this framework based on the charter, the founding charter, and the constitutional principles of Mexico so that we can continue to build and strengthen peace and development all the time. International law is an undeniable tool for international relations and undergirds human rights and the rights of all people. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Next, we have the Ambassador Abdallah. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The first time that I have asked for the floor is to say that the truth of the matter is I appreciate this report, but it's truly a report that has to be looked at and from a political standpoint as well. Well, the conclusions, the first thing is that the depth of what was observed and the profound nature of the process, which is much more complex than any of us could delve into or could have even imagined. It's truly interesting to see, and what Julian and Magdalena and everybody said, because the complexity of this is truly epic in terms of what happened in Bolivia. So, Mr. Chairman, we can move ahead with recommendations, and recommendations should be made. There are recommendations, they are there. I understand that recommendations should be made within the process whereby the idea of justice should be rightly placed in an autonomous, independent place in the political system, so that the problems we have or the difficulties we have in the region and on the planet Earth and in judicial systems and attorney general's offices can be looked at. And this has been looked at intelligently. Now, of the conclusions, there's little else to say in terms of the responsibility of this state. And these state agents in particular I agree that we have to have justice that allows us to see what happens. We have to move ahead and see what will come of this. In the conclusions, it speaks to political polarization that was deepened, and there was criteria that was used as to whether or not certain elements were going to be used to be or not be a part of Bolivian society. And Bolivia has to be looked at all parts that might lead to exclusion, racist views were particularly meted out at that time. I have spoken to Ambassador Arce, and I must confess that seeing these kinds of things is still quite striking to me. It is of a structural nature. These kinds of structural issues have to be reviewed when it comes to these kinds of things. In the times of today, these are the points that we have to consider. Over the course of history in our organization, we have looked at these kinds of electoral processes and different perspectives, but this is just one more element in the colossal amount of things that have to be looked at and interpreted in terms of what happens. So I insist, the encouraging part of the report is that, well, look, I'm a lawyer and I see this report that shows a host of different responsibilities. For me, this is proof, it's definitive proof, and it's very impactful. For lawyers, you have to have evidence. On page 155, you got a whole caravan of different points. Page 145, we've got a picture of the seized vehicles, and so on and so forth. I could go on. But when I step forward, I have to have evidence for the prosecutors or the judges, and that those things have to be refuted or not. We have to look at the madness, actually, of what happened. This report is exceptional. It's a sterling piece of work. I would like to thank all of you. My deepest thanks for everything that was done. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, Secretary General, everybody that contributed, and those who were present, which had and took on positive responsibility. It's really hard to draw conclusions, but I'm coming up to the last point. If we only draw conclusions from the analytical standpoint, it's a trend that's really very important from think tanks or from specialists, then we will be floating in the clouds. But the hope that is here, as mentioned by Ambassador Arce, is that from this kind of documentation, we come up with concrete structural changes to the system, because that's the key. That, for me, is basically the key. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We'd like to turn next to the representative from Venezuela. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to begin by thanking the group of experts for their presentations. As Ambassador Abdallah has pointed out, it's a very long report, and today I have paid close attention to the presentations, although I didn't have time to read the report. And I believe that the presentations were very objective. And I think that's very important and needs to be kept in mind. What is very clear is that there were terrible violations of human rights, abuses, racial discrimination, deaths. But as the experts point out, the actors are from all political stripes. And so we ask that there are reparations for victims, that there is due process, and that investigations are impartial and go forward. And I think that this is what Latin America needs to aspire to when we're thinking about human rights. We have a recommendation to reform justice. This is also something we should aspire to. I agree wholeheartedly with the ambassador of Uruguay. I don't think we can disagree with anything in this report. Indeed, I think we need to agree and support what they have stated in the report. Chair, Julian Berger said that the report or the presentations made today, well, we can't infer that there was electoral fraud or not, or we can't infer that there was a coup d'etat or not. I think this is an important point that he made, and I think that underscores that what the expert wanted was to be impartial. So to try to say that the Secretary General or the OAS were at fault in this, well, at the very least, this is highly speculative, and I know that some have suggested this. We want to say that reports on human rights violations need to be based on on-site investigations when there are violations of human rights. And for example, I have to refer to Venezuela. The IACHR, however, can't go to Venezuela. And the government of Maduro has wanted to withdraw from the Inter-American human rights system, and Venezuela, long before that, did not invite the commission to go. Nonetheless, the IACHR from outside, based on reports of the press and civil society, have been able to detect and denounce human rights violations. And we have seen this presented to the OAS, and the IACHR has pointed out these massive human rights violations. And these are based on on-site testimony. Now, with regard to electoral observation missions, most EOMs of the OAS affirm that these were legitimate elections, or that's usually what happens. People are able to cast their vote fairly, and in their reports they talk about this. Now, when EOMs say that the election was fair, it surely was fair, but I'm sure that they could also point out in reports irregularities or violations of democratic standards. So in a report of an EOM, well, when they say that there was fraud, I don't think this is undue intervention in a country's affairs. DOM has in reports where it points out irregularities and others where it does not. So I believe that the EOM from the OAS, when it says that this was a legitimate election, it was not fraudulent, then we believe it. And when it says that this is not the case, we should also believe it and not try to use this based on our political ideology. I don't think we should be undermining the actions of the EOMs or of the Secretary General. Thank you.
Next, we have the representative for Bolivia. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just 1 minute, if I may, to respond to the question that was posed by Dr. Julian Berger and to all members of this group. I'd like to say that Bolivia committed to this in August in La Paz. You presented your report to the Bolivian society, and we committed to implement all measures fully. And I'm pleased to tell you that on 21st and 22nd of this month, the ICHR and the Bolivian state will be signing off on the follow-up mechanism for the recommendations of your report. And this is the raison d'etre of this group and its report. Chair, once again, I want to thank all of the members of the interdisciplinary group of independent experts, and we also thank all countries and all ambassadors and governments that have spoken. We appreciate that they have supported the work that is in pro of human rights. States must protect human rights, and we must protect the right to life. This is something that comes from the Roman Empire, and I think we need to support all work that supports human rights, and this is what we're trying to do. So we appreciate all of the presentations made, and we are going to implement the recommendations in the report, and we hope that this can help other countries so that the constitutional order is never interrupted anywhere. There are political and legal responsibilities. There are still investigations ongoing, and analyses need to be done at all levels by institutions. We thank you, Chair, and we thank the group of experts, the SG, the ASG, and all persons who have been involved in this matter, which is very important, not just for us, but for the entire community of the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We should not close this session without hearing from our distinguished Secretary General. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank you for including this important item on our order of business. I want to thank our experts, Patricia Tapatay, Marlene Weichert, Magdalena Correa, and Julian Berger, as members of the GIEI. We have taken note of the group's reports, the horrible violations of human rights documented, and in that regard, we want to express our sincere condolences to the families of the victims who perished because of human rights violations in Bolivia. Now, this is 2 years later, but we want to express that we cannot bring these people back. However, we need to continue on. Therefore, with these investigations, there were people massacred in these events, people, thousands wounded, people who were tortured, who were arbitrarily arrested. When we talk about stability, we had a communique on Sunday the 10th. When we call on governments to act within constitutional purviews to respect human rights, we want to avoid these kind of violent events. We cannot use institutions for our own ends. This is important for any country, for our hemisphere. We need to make a difference. We need to respect constitutional mandates, the terms of those who are elected. I want to respond to a false narration with regard to the 78 electoral observation missions. The result thereof, they speak for themselves. And we recognize the work of the EOMs and the Electoral Missions Department. And again, we thank the interdisciplinary group of independent experts. Thank you, Chair.
If there are no further comments, the Chair suggests that the Permanent Council take note of the report of the interdisciplinary group of independent experts and extend thanks to its members for their work and for the completion of the report. The Chair also expresses thanks to the delegations for the comments that were offered and has taken due note of those, which will be reflected in the minutes of the meeting. Now, esteemed colleagues, as you may recall, in January of 2021, the OAS historic headquarters buildings were honored by the U.S. Secretary of the Interior with the designation as a National Historic Landmark, the highest level of recognition of a historic site in the United States. On November 18th, Ambassador Jose Fiallo, permanent representative of the Dominican Republic and former chair of the Permanent Council, sent to the Secretary of the Interior an invitation to commemorate and celebrate this historic designation at a meeting of the Permanent Council. We are therefore very honored to be joined this morning by Mr. Charles F. Sams III, Director of the United States National Park Service. Mr. Sams was ceremonially sworn in as the 19th Director of the National Park Service on December 16, 2021, by the U.S. Secretary of the Interior. He was the first Native American to serve in this role. He most recently served as Oregon Governor Kate Brown's appointee to the Pacific Northwest Power and Conservation Council, where he held a position as a council member from March to December of 2021. Prior to joining the Northwest Council, he served as the executive director for the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. For more than 25 years, Director Sams has worked in tribal and state government and in the nonprofit National Resource and conservation management field, with an emphasis on the responsibility of strong stewardship for land preservation for this and future generations. Director Sams is a veteran of the U.S. Navy, where he served as an intelligence specialist. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from Concordia University and a Master of Legal Studies in Indigenous Peoples Law from the University of Oklahoma School of Law. On behalf of the Permanent Council, I extend a cordial welcome to Mr. Charles F. Sams III, Director of the United States National Park Service. Director Sams, you have the floor, sir.
Good day, my friends and relatives. My name is Chuck Sams. I am the 19th Director of the National Park Service, and I want to say thank you to Ambassador Hall and to the Permanent Council for inviting me to be with you today. On behalf of Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland and the National Park Service, it is an honor to be joining you here. National Historic Landmarks are the nation's most important historic places. Designated by the Secretary of Interior, they possess exceptional value in illustrating or interpreting our heritage. The goal of this program is to ensure that the stories of nationally important historic and cultural events, places, and people are recognized and preserved for everyone's benefit. More than 2,600 properties share this designation. Most of these places are preserved through dedicated partners like yourselves. As Americans, we share an important responsibility to preserve the places and stories of our history. The importance of sharing stories to promote equity and inclusion. We celebrate the designation of the Organization of American States Headquarters Building, historically known as the Pan American Union, as a National Historic Landmark. This designation recognizes the beauty and meaning behind the classical architecture and landscape and the melding of Western and Mesoamerican design motifs. Also, the important work the Pan American Union and Organization of American States has undertaken here for the past 110 years. The building's meaningful international relationship throughout the Western Hemisphere. The building, founded in 1889, what became the Pan American Union and later the Organization of American States, was conceived as part trade agency, part Latin American library, and part symbol of inter-American cooperation and friendship. Throughout the 20th century, the institution developed into the hemisphere's foremost center of diplomacy, a place for high-level diplomatic meetings where organizational leaders set international agendas, implement policy, and arbitrate conflicts. The architects who designed this building intended it to be an expression of the Pan-American movement. The architecture and sculpture reflect the melding of Western classic design with the indigenous motifs, particularly Aztec, Incan, and Mayan iconography. The complex sculptural program represents the organization's original goal of promoting trade, unity, and political cooperation within the Americas. President Biden will be hosting the 19th Summit of the Americas this June in Los Angeles, California. The focus, of course, building a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for our hemisphere. The administration has underscored America's deep and historic commitment to the people of the Western Hemisphere, as well as our commitment to realizing the Build Back Better World initiative. With climate challenges at the forefront, it will take global collaboration to build climate resiliency and address this crisis. The historic location we celebrate today physically represents the origins of this commitment, expanding our economic and cultural ties, building upon our shared democratic values, our commitment to the rule of law, and our determination to protect the human rights of all. The nomination of the Pan American Union was funded by the National Park Service as part of the American Latinos History Initiative, and we are very pleased to have worked with partners like the Organization of American States to recognize and protect this unique place. OAS has carefully stewarded the property since its construction, preserved its beauty and stories, and generously opened it to the public to learn from. The National Park Service and the Department of Interior look forward to continuing our partnership with the Organization of American States as it continues to steward this special historic place and the people and stories reflected in it. Thank you for allowing me to join you today.
Thank you for your presentation, Director Sands. I now offer the floor to the coordinators of the regional groups and other delegations who wish to refer to this agenda item. We have first Mexico. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. My delegation is thrilled that the OAS historic buildings have been designated as National Historic Landmarks by the U.S. Park Service. After 100 years, these architectural buildings and its architecture show that we are part of the same hemisphere and that we have come together so we can have sustainable development and peace. We see ourselves in many of the decorative elements used in the buildings. Many are from pre-Hispanic centuries. For example, we have the Patio Azteca. We have the sculpture of the god of flowers, which is located outside our building. We also have the gallery of the museum, which has been inspired by Mayan and Aztec architecture. We also have a sculpture of the president of our republic, Benito Juarez, who was an indigenous man and who he was someone who promoted the respect for the rights of everyone. This is important both with regard to hemispheric and universal rights. We also see the artistic worth of the buildings. We recognize the work that was done, and we thank Ambassador James Lambert for his involvement in this. We believe that thanks to this, more citizens of the Americas will learn about the history of our organization. Thank you.
Very much. We next make available the floor to Panama. You have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. I take the floor on behalf of Honduras, Panama, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, all members of SICA, in order to celebrate the historic buildings designation as a National Historic Landmark. We want to thank Mr. Charles Sam, the Director of the U.S. National Park Service, for coming to this meeting of the Permanent Council. We are very proud of this designation, and it's not because of the beautiful architectural work. This building that is the headquarters of the OAS shows our history. First, the history of Pan-Americanism, which was a multilateral effort to help our citizens, and then became the headquarters of our organization. Since its conception, the architects conceived this building as a symbol of the unity of our hemisphere through eclectic architecture, using different French, Portuguese, indigenous and Spanish elements to show the richness of our hemisphere, the symbolism that these elements show, the marble in the facade, the different steps, the fountains, all of this shows equality amongst all states, the importance of the influence of each country of the community in the development of our hemisphere. As we see from the condor and the eagle from the north, which is to underscore the values. After the building was finished in 1910, well, for 110 years, it has inspired its visitors. It was thought of to foster peace and cooperation between American countries. That peace we all desire, represented in the gardens of the outside of the building. William Taft planted a tree for peace, and this is still important for us. Our history as American nations has developed like our building has developed. It is now recognized as an historic building, which is an honor. We also want to recognize the Secretary of Hemispheric Affairs, Ambassador Lambert, for helping to bring about this designation that we are so proud of, because we believe it shows the importance of all our cultures. So many important things have happened for our people in this building. It shows our joint history. Every space, every corner, even the gardens show the goals we have attained to support multilateralism that is constructive and peace, the compass that should always guide us. We take definitive decisions that are important for multidimensional security, for integral development, for human rights, for democracy. And we continue to do this, whether it be at hybrid meetings, face-to-face meetings, or virtual meetings. But this really is something that we are so proud of, to have this as an historic building. Thank you so very much.
You're most welcome. Next, we have the representative for the USA, Mr. Liston. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you once again, Mr. Chair. On behalf of my own government, I would like to welcome the participation of Mr. Sams and express our appreciation for his attendance on this very special occasion. As many may already be aware, the United States maintains 28 heritage properties located in 15 OAS member states, including 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites and 7 that are locally or nationally protected. The Tangier legation in Morocco was the first building acquired by the Department of State, and it is the only U.S. National Historic Landmark located on foreign soil. Indeed, we are honored to have the OAS headquarters building elevated to National Historic Landmark status. Thank you.
You're very welcome, sir. Next, we have Canada. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Let me start by thanking Mr. Sams for his presentation this morning, and also thank Ambassador Jamie Lambert for the work that he has done, I know, as well. It's an honor to have a moment this morning to mark Canada's participation in this event to commemorate the designation of the OAS historic buildings as National Historic Landmarks. Canada may be one of the more recent members of this organization, but we take great pride, and I think we all do, in the long history of the organization, and fully appreciate the role it has played and that it continues to play in shaping our destiny as a region. And the commemoration not only reminds us of how much we look forward to being able to work together, but it also reminds us of those who came before us and the notable moments that have brought us to where we are today. And there's been some examples already given this morning: the dedication of the OAS main building by the United States President William Taft in 1910, signature of the Panama Canal Treaty in the Hall of the Americas in 1977. I could go on and list many other events and important issues that have been discussed and debated and argued over and worked through over the course of the past years. but I think just a sense of the significance of this building for its work. I think at the same time, it would be remiss of me if I didn't also note the responsibility that we all have to make sure that we're caring for the building. Much has been accomplished in recent years to ensure that the OAS is able to invest in the maintenance of its property, but work still remains, and we will need some innovative thinking to address the organization's real property challenges, including taking some difficult decisions. So let's today not only be a celebration of a storied past, but also let's use it as a clear call for action as we work together to chart a sustainable future in the Organization of American States. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We'll hear now from the Observer France. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary General, very briefly, I truly appreciate the previous comments, and we appreciate Ambassador or Ms. Anmango's presentation, as well as all member states, as we celebrate today. As has already been said, this is an emblem, an icon of the hemisphere. It has a lot of history with it. It represents multilateralism, and it's a very strong symbol. It represents France, the Americas, and it was designed by a French architect, Mr. Cret, Philippe Cret, who bore all of this in mind in 1945. So I'm very proud to represent this cornerstone and be in the building. Thank you very much.
Next, we have the Ambassador for the Dominican Republic, I believe that is. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Dominican delegation would like to thank the Ambassador Lambert for having requested including this topic on the agenda today in the Permanent Council meeting. We would also like to say we appreciate Ambassador Sam's, or Director Sam's words. And as well, all the comments made by the Director of the United States National Park Service and all of those who are participating in the Permanent Council to commemorate this fact. For all of the Americas, this is our home. It's ours. It's a common place, representing common values. The Secretary of the United States, at that time, when it was the Pan-American Union, in the hands of the Director General at that time, looked forward. And today, we truly appreciate this and commemorate this declaration by the Department of the Interior of the United States as an OAS historic building. It's a true historic landmark in the country. And the former presidents have recognized this on the 26th of April, 1810. We would like to avail us of this opportunity to underscore this memory. But the building with more than 110 years in the OAS is one of the most iconic buildings in Washington, D.C. It's an architectural work of art with its own cultural and historical ties. And at the same time, it's witness of many major events that have taken place in the Americas. This is an opportunity to move forward and underscore this very important meaning, recognizing the various important components, where we have the Hall of the Americas, which is one of the most famous rooms in Washington, the Bolivar room, the Guerrero, and all the other rooms as well. The building recognized today is or has been witness to many different events. It's a place for dialogue, exchange of ideas, and it's an arena which has resolved main tensions, major conflicts by the member states of the organization, as well as taking care of other points in the hemisphere, which houses the ASG, the Secretary General, as well as other civil service in this organization and member states, doing their level best for peace, security, and upholding human rights for all peoples. One of the most highlighted points in the OAS is that it's a way where we have come together for agreements. And 45 years ago, in fact, we did everything for the Americas. And we had witnesses of all of these acts of justice and sovereignty, the protagonists of which were two main and very important people in the hemisphere. We just heard about the Tree of Peace, underscored, from 1910. And this tree is a big symbol for our organization. And in times of despair and threat, we moved ahead, and the highlights of everything that we've done is representative for the entire world. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Ambassador Abdullah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. For me, we are looking at a building which I came to and had an academic affiliation with. It's the way of things. The form is the foundation is the form. So we have a building, all of us are part of this building, which is very impressive. It has its own personality. It's not just a building. It has its own connotations, its historical meaning because of everything it represents. And basically, it gives us a place for building and weaving together defensive rights and diplomacy. It has lasted over time, and it will continue in time to knit together all good things. And for each and every one of us, we find something which changes our life. It's art, it's sculpture, it's culture. In the final analysis, it's a summation of everything, of the past and the present. And in this present moment, it brings us into the present so that it's a building. It's not just a building for us. What we have is a construction. It's a marvelous work of art. It represents us. And this is the important point. I really feel moved when I go into the building. I understand the weight of responsibility when I enter. And then there's the architecture. In some form or fashion, the architecture takes on an awareness of its own role instead of just being hallowed halls. And it harbors all the history. And it shines. We've been away from it because of the pandemic, but we will soon go back. Thank you.
Off to the Secretary General, I must insert my own indications, and that is the site is authentic and it is of outstanding universal value. Those are the two criteria that the UNESCO uses in determining its heritage sites. It must be authentic, and it certainly has that, and its value in terms of its service over the years is very much there. Unlike many of the other sites in Washington, D.C., UNESCO does not recognize persons, it recognizes structures. And this building represents that. The Secretary General, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. As of the importance that our organizations have had in shaping the Americas. This magnificent building, which houses the headquarters of the organization, was built with generous funding from Andrew Carnegie and has become one of his most notable public gifts. On April 26, 1910, leaders of the nations of the Americas came together to dedicate this building. On that day, as a symbol of good faith and solidarity, President William Howard Taft planted a peace tree in the center of our magnificent headquarters. Former Director General of the Pan American Union, John Barrett, said about the building, this monumental intention is to give visible expression to the ideas of unity, of solidarity, of amity that found realization in the Union of American Republics. This is not only a palace, but the spiritual home of the citizens of the American republics that make up the organization. The House of America represents the institutional expression of Pan-Americanism, a late 19th century movement which turned out to be the precursor of the network of regional multilateral institutions that has grown up today. Although the initial impulse of the Pan-American Union was commercial, its true value over the next century was at the site for the negotiation of the web of international treaties and jurisprudence that has served the region well. Agreements, conventions, and laws crafted by the organization set the standards for the conduct of international relations between OAS member countries that strive for peace, security, and conflict resolution. This includes the launch as early as the 1920s of institutions such as the Inter-American Women's Commission, one of the world's first regional institutions dealing with gender issues. It also served as a site for the resolution of disputes between members. To see its value, you only have to look at the changes recorded over the 100 years of the 20th century to the different maps in the world which has transformed on multiple occasions by the collapse of countries. Then compare that to the Americas, which aside from the obviously significant impact of the colonization in the Caribbean, has remained largely unchanged. Much of that was due to the careful crafting of a web of inter-American jurisprudence and the existence of the Pan American Union as a forum to resolve disputes. Indeed, the maturity of the inter-American system, particularly in dealing with bilateral issues, was so well established that when the United Nations Charter was negotiated after World War II, it referred in Chapter 8, Article 52 to the existing regional institutions as the agencies of first resort to be engaged before bringing matters to the Security Council. The Pan American Union and the OAS, which succeeded in 1948, also served as the site for the negotiation of the treaties that gave rise to the whole web of multilateral institutions such as the Pan American Health Organization, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Inter-American Agricultural Commission, that today we refer to as Inter-American System. More recent high points include the signing of the Panama Canal Treaty in 1977, the establishment of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and adoption, and all our permanent work related to democracy. Along the way, member states and the organization itself have been called upon to address the salient issues of the day. In a region prone to disasters, natural disasters, this faculty has been critical. Special missions have been formed, and we keep working on the ground with the people. Director Sands The decision of the Department of the Interior to designate the historical OAS headquarters a National Heritage Landmark is an extraordinary recognition of this history. The House of the Americas stands as the embodiment of peace and prosperity of the hemisphere. In these difficult moments, we strengthen our resolve to do our part to facilitate peace and conflict resolution. We need peace in the world. We need peace in the Americas. We at the OAS strive to effectively implement our essential purpose based on our four main pillars. There are goals shared by our host country, the United States. These are goals shared by our host country, the United States. And so it is gratifying and humbling for us to have this building designated as a National Historic Landmark, the highest level of recognition of a historic site in the United States by the Secretary of Interior. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
You're very welcome, sir. I thank Director Sams and the delegations, including the Secretary General, who have taken the floor to address this commemoration. I also thank Ambassador James Lambert and his team from the Secretary of Hemispheric Affairs for their tireless work to achieve this honorable and historic distinction for our headquarters. The next item on the agenda is the consideration of the draft resolution titled Place and Date of the 8th Meeting of the Ministers Responsible for Public Security in the Americas, convened by Resolutions 2950 and 2970, at the request of the Chair of the Committee on Hemispheric Security and as reflected in document CP.575822. In this regard, I recognize the permanent representative of El Salvador who will present this draft resolution. Ambassador Vasquez, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for including this item on the agenda at this section in compliance with the mandate from the General Assembly of the organization in paragraph 22 of AG Res 2970. Promotion of peace and security multidimensional approach. In this regard, my delegation would like to put before you for your consideration and approval the draft resolution entitled Place and Date of the 8th Meeting of Ministers Responsible for Public Security in the Americas, convened by that resolution, which we propose to have in El Salvador on October 24th and 25th, 2022. Multidimensional security is crucial to the organization and means that we have to do our level best and pull together efforts for each and every one of our countries. We hope that MISPA 8, the Maximum Forum for Public Security in the Americas, will offer an opportunity to strengthen dialogue amongst the various authorities, as well as an exchange of experiences and good practices, identifying ways that we can connect, based on which we will take pragmatic and strategic solutions undergirding cooperation amongst our countries. Mr. Chairman, we truly appreciate beforehand the support of all member states behind this resolution and all of the preparatory work with a view to guaranteeing tangible and fruitful results for the hemisphere. At the event, we will be happy to receive the ministers of the region when it comes to security in October in San Salvador. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Ambassador Vasquez, I now submit for consideration the Permanent Council the draft resolution titled Date of the 21st Regular Session of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, convened by Resolution 2950 and contained in document CP.5758/22 as presented by the Committee on Hemispheric Security. If there are no comments, we will proceed to its approval. The next item on the agenda was included on the order of business at the request of the Chair of the Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Affairs. I submit for consideration authorization of the Permanent Council the draft resolution entitled authorization to use resources from the Indirect Cost Recovery Reserve Subfund to finance the extension of projects from mandate prioritization and development of the strategic plan of the organization for 2021 through 2024, contained in document CP Doc 5759/22, approved by the committee at its meeting of February 16, 2022. If there are no comments, we will proceed to its approval. Approved. The next item on the agenda corresponds to the commemoration of the Rare Disease Day. In response to the request of the Permanent Mission of Brazil, as coordinator of the OAS Group of Friends of Persons with Disabilities, contained in document CP/INF 9294/22. Rare Disease Day is the globally coordinated movement on rare diseases, working towards equity in social opportunity, health care, and access to diagnosis and therapies for people living with a rare disease. Since its creation in 2008, Rare Disease Day has played a critical part in building an international rare disease community that is multi-disease, global, and diverse, but united in purpose. Rare Disease Day is observed every year on February 28th or February 29th in leap years, the rarest day of the year. In that regard, I am pleased to offer the floor to the delegation of Brazil.
Mr. Chairman, first, I would like to thank you, Your Excellency, for quickly accepting inclusion of this very important topic on today's Permanent Council agenda. Brazil made this request as coordinator in turn with the group of friends or group of friends of persons with disabilities related above-mentioned commemoration. And based on the delegation of Peru's suggestion, a member state that has worked both in the hemisphere as well as in the United Nations on this topic to promote the rights of people with rare diseases. The World Health Organization, of all of its members, recognizes people with rare diseases. But there are about 6,000 to 8,000 different kinds of rare diseases in the entire world, it is estimated. And we have multiple sclerosis, mild Cushing's disease, autoimmune diseases, in addition to many others. And basically we're talking about chronic progressive diseases that incapacitate people. They're degenerative diseases, which hampers the quality of life of people who have these diseases. And in addition to that, many of them don't have any cures. Treatment is with clinical accompaniment, and in addition to other biological means with a view to alleviating some of the symptoms or stemming progress. These rare diseases have chronic and systemic pictures with a lot of risks for more vulnerable people, for senior citizens and others. The rights of people with these rare diseases point to our countries that should be committed, and we should give a voice to this part of the population. Thus, we propose having a memory for the existence of these diseases, and we would like to highlight the need of our countries to include these citizens. In this regard, then, Mr. Chairman, I'm very honored, with your permission, to read the following declaration on behalf of the Group of Friends of Persons with Disabilities. In the OAS, declaration of the Group of Friends of Persons with Disabilities by the OAS group for this Rare Disease Day. 1. The group of Friends of Persons with Disabilities, the OAS, point to the commemoration of this day, Rare Disease Day, and establish the last day of February 28th, so that we can raise the awareness of these kinds of rare diseases that progressively hurt the well-being, the health, and the development of people who have to grapple with them, particularly children as well as others. We recognize that any rare disease can develop and lead to a disability, which will be a barrier to development and to enjoying rights and full-fledged participation and inclusion in society. Concerned with people who have rare diseases and their families when they run greater risks and when they are hit disproportionately with discrimination and social exclusion, and are particularly heavily meted out to women because of a lack of awareness and access to specialists. We note that over the last 2 years, of course, the situation has been exacerbated because of COVID-19. Thus, we have Resolution 6632, resolution entitled Dealing with People Who Live with Rare Disease, approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 15th of December 2021, during which time there was a special meeting which broached across the board all of the challenges that people have who have rare diseases, as well as those of their families. Thus, we should like to invite member states to consider adopting public policies and national laws that broach the situation that hits these people and their families, incorporating different ways and means so that these people can enjoy their human rights in keeping with the commitments that we have taken on in the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, the Inter-American Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against People with Disabilities, and the Convention for Rights for People with Disabilities of the United Nations, and for the Decade of the Americas for the rights and dignity of people, in addition to other things. We would like to ask that societies contribute to crafting public policies and other strategies which will lead to inclusive opportunities and the removal of all kinds of barriers for people who live with these kinds of health conditions. On behalf of human rights and for all member states, we need to consider people with rare diseases and their families in the preparatory work, the 52nd regular session of the General Assembly of the OAS. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman.
I now offer the floor to delegations. And first we have Peru. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, permanent representatives and member states, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, we truly appreciate inclusion of this topic in today's meeting. And we appreciate the role of the SEMA as coordinator of this group of Friends of Persons with Disabilities. As a member of the group of friends, we truly appreciate the progress that is made and the inclusion of this topic on the agenda of the Organization of American States. We, in the Permanent Council, note that this issue is being taken on for the very first time, and in this council, we would like to honor that effort. Today, it is a very, very important step. We truly appreciate the work that has also been done by the various agencies on this, as was underscored by the representative of Brazil. The World Health Organization began these initiatives and has accorded great importance to them. In the region, there are about 30 to 50,000 people who are affected. And in Peru, Mr. Chairman, more than 2 million people have at least one kind of deformity of some kind or another. So there's also the additional problem of these people and their family members throughout the entire hemisphere. Now in the OAS, we cannot look askance at this, and we have to have a laser focus on this, as well as look towards the participation when it comes to inclusion of these people who are in our countries, and this will be to improve their condition. Peru will continue to double its efforts so that we can ensure that this item is an item on the OAS agenda, and of course, so that we can consider and work with all of the preparatory works for the next General Assembly, which will take place in Peru. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, sir. Next, we have the Ambassador for Panama. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I take the floor on behalf of the SICA countries, Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, in order to welcome this initiative of including the commemoration of Rare Disease Day on our order of business. 100 million people live with a rare disease in the world, and 12% live in Latin America. We calculate that there are 7,000 diseases of these kind, but until last year, in December 2021, the UN adopted the first resolution in history about how to address the challenges of the people who live with a rare disease. This is an innovative initiative to show solidarity with these people. One of the great challenges of rare diseases is a timely diagnosis. So we want to make more visible and make people aware, as well as express our solidarity to support all of those who suffer from a rare disease so that they can get treatment, timely diagnosis, and will allow for quality of life. From the SICA group, we agree that it is important to have international mobilization which allow people to have equitable access to diagnosis, treatment, and quality medical care. These are challenges that go hand in hand with equitable access to health, universal health that is on our 2030 agenda. To finalize, on behalf of SICA countries, we recognize the need to protect the human rights of everyone, including those who suffer from these quote-unquote rare disease, and where multilateralism plays an important role in our efforts as a region, we can help these people. Thank you.
Next, we have the Ambassador Ordonez. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Taking into account that we have little time, I have just taken the floor to support the commemoration of Rare Disease Day. And here at the Permanent Council, we welcome that this has been put on our agenda. Colombia agrees with those who have also voiced this support. Those who suffer from rare diseases, we want to make sure they can overcome any hurdles. We think it is necessary to help them to be able to enjoy their human rights, which are inalienable. Thank you, Chair.
Next, we have Mexico. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. My delegation thanks Peru for the initiative to put this on our agenda and to celebrate the commemoration of Rare Disease Day. As the declaration states, and my country supports this, people who have a rare disease can develop disabilities and face many hurdles that affect their development and their inclusion in society. So we make an appeal to use a human rights approach, an intersectional approach to address this problem, and we thank El Salvador for coordinating the Friends Group. Now, Mexico reiterates its support to jointly support the group's plan of action. Thank you.
Next, we have the ambassador for Brazil. You have the floor, sir.
Senhor Presidente.
Chair, thank you very much. And I have quickly taken the floor on behalf of the group of friends of people who have rare disease, as well as on behalf of my mission. In Brazil, there are 3 million people with rare diseases, and 75% are children. And so we had positive change, luckily, in 2014, when we established the concept of rare disease, but also established mechanisms and care for these people who have rare diseases. We have many clinics that diagnose and treat these diseases, and in 2020 in Brazil, we established the Brazilian Committee on Rare Diseases to develop intersectoral policies and technology and innovation to care for those who have rare diseases in order to improve their quality of life. We also had the inclusion of other resources to help these people, specialists who are now studying just rare diseases. And we have volunteer groups that help those people and their families who live with rare diseases. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Paraguay. You have the floor.